The music itself gets all the attention, the melody, the lyrics, the voice that carries it all forward. But the silence between notes is where music actually lives. It's where the listener breathes, where the emotion lands, where the human being behind the performance becomes visible just for a moment before the next note arrives and the armor goes back up. On a Wednesday evening in March, inside the Ed Sullivan Theater on West 53rd Street, a silence arrived between notes, and it didn't leave. What happened next is not the kind of story that gets told in press releases or award show speeches. It doesn't have a clean arc or a satisfying resolution or a lesson that fits inside a caption. It's messier than that, more honest than that. It's the story of a woman who couldn't finish a song and a man who decided, without thinking, without planning, without asking anyone's permission, that finishing it was the most important thing he could do. The evening had started the way all late show evenings started, which is to say it started with controlled chaos that looked, from the audience's perspective, like effortless joy. The warm-up act had the crowd primed and laughing. The band, loose and bright and chronically, joyfully overqualified for the room, was working through a sound check that kept drifting into something that sounded suspiciously like a full concert. John Batiste had a way of treating every room like it deserved his best, which meant that even the stagehands were nodding along as they ran cable across the stage floor. Stephen Colbert was in his dressing room, jacket on, notes reviewed, doing the thing he always did in the final minutes before airtime, standing very still with his eyes closed like a man listening for something just below the threshold of hearing. His assistant had learned over 3 years not to interrupt this particular stillness unless a building was on fire. The building was not on fire, but something was already moving that night, some current beneath the ordinary surface of a Wednesday taping that the people who pay attention to these things would later say they felt before anyone could name it. Her name was Claire Ashworth. She was 34 years old, though she carried herself with the particular confidence of someone who had been performing since childhood and had therefore packed about 60 years of stage experience into 3 decades of living. She had a voice that critics described exhaustingly and accurately as a force of nature, the kind of voice that doesn't ask the room for its attention but simply takes it cleanly and without apology. She had released 3 albums, sold out 2 international tours, won awards that came in heavy glass and required a specific shelf to display them properly. She had performed at inaugurations and memorials, and once, memorably, at a small bar in Nashville for 11 people during a tour bus breakdown, and had given the 11 people the same performance she'd give 11,000. She was, by any reasonable measure, a professional. She was also, by a measure that had nothing to do with professionalism, a woman who had spent the last 14 months carrying something very heavy and telling almost no one about it. Her mother had died 15 months ago, quickly, the way the body sometimes makes decisions that the mind hasn't caught up with yet. A diagnosis in October and a funeral in November, and then the holidays arriving with their brutal, indifferent cheerfulness. Claire had gone back on the road in January because the road was the only place that still made complete sense to her. The schedule, the sound checks, the ritual of the set list, the way a song could hold you accountable to finishing it even when everything inside you wanted to stop. She had been finishing songs for 14 months. She had been very good at it until tonight. The first 2 segments of the show ran cleanly. Stephen's monologue was sharp, a riff on the particular absurdity of current events that had the audience in that loose, generous state where almost anything would land. The first guest, a documentary filmmaker with a story about tracking wolves in Yellowstone, turned out to be unexpectedly funny in the dry, self-deprecating way that wildlife scientists sometimes are, and the segment ran long in the best possible way. Claire was scheduled for the 3rd segment, musical guest, 1 song, standard setup. Her band had done the sound check that afternoon without incident. The song was from her new album, a ballad, slower than her usual material, built around a piano line that her guitarist described as the kind of melody that sits in your chest for 3 days after you hear it. The guitar was right. It was that kind of melody. Claire came out from behind the curtain to warm, genuine applause. She wore a simple black dress, no jewelry except small gold earrings. Her dark hair was down. She sat at the piano. She always sat at the piano for this one. It was her song in the most literal sense. She had written it on a rented upright in a hotel room in Edinburgh at 2 a.m. And she adjusted the microphone and looked briefly at the audience with the calm, practiced expression of someone who has done this 10,000 times. She placed her hands on the keys. She began. The first verse was perfect, technically perfect, emotionally perfect. The kind of performance that makes sound engineers exhale slowly and audience members lean forward without realizing they're doing it. Her voice filled the theater in the way that great voices do, not loudly but completely, the way water fills a space, finding every corner. The chorus arrived and the band came in beneath her, subtle and precise. The theater was very still. Even the people who hadn't known her music an hour ago were inside it now, held there by something they couldn't have articulated but would have recognized as the feeling of being genuinely moved. She moved into the second verse, and then she stopped, not gradually, not with a visible struggle or a warning sign. She simply stopped in the middle of a line on a word that had no logical reason to be the last word. Remember. And the music continued for 2 more beats without her before the band, one by one, recognized what was happening and let it go quiet. The silence was absolute. Claire sat at the piano with her hands still resting on the keys. She was not crying, not yet, not visibly. She was somewhere else. Her eyes were open, but they were looking at something that wasn't in the theater, something that required the middle distance to find. The audience didn't move, didn't cough, didn't shift, didn't make the small collective sounds that audiences make when they're uncertain what to do. They simply held the moment with her, the way you hold something fragile and don't know if it's yours to hold, but hold it anyway because it's there and it's falling. At the desk, Stephen Colbert had gone completely still. He had hosted thousands of musical performances. He had seen nerves and technical failures, and once memorably a guitarist who had played an entire song in the wrong key and finished with a bow. He knew what a performer looked like when something had gone wrong with the equipment or the monitor or the arrangement. This was not that. This was something else entirely, and he knew it in the way you know things that bypass language and go directly to the body. He put down his cards. Behind the cameras, the control room had entered a specific kind of silence. The silence of people who were very good at their jobs suddenly encountering a situation that their jobs did not prepare them for. The director, a woman named Patricia Yuen, who had been directing live television for 19 years, kept her eyes on the monitor and said nothing. The producer beside her started to speak, and she put her hand up briefly, and he stopped. On the monitor, the camera held on Claire. 30 seconds passed. It felt like considerably longer. Stephen stood up from his desk. This was not in any rundown. There was no protocol for the host standing up during the musical guest performance. It simply wasn't a thing that happened, which meant there was no procedure for responding to it, which meant that Patricia Yuen made a decision with the quiet speed of someone who has earned the right to make fast decisions. She kept all 3 cameras rolling and said nothing into anyone's earpiece. Stephen walked around the desk. He walked across the stage. He stopped at the edge of the performance area, where the wood of the stage met the slight elevation of the piano riser, close enough that Claire would know he was there, far enough that the space was still hers if she wanted it. He didn't say anything. He just stood there. Claire became aware of him the way you become aware of someone who's being very careful not to impose, gradually, peripherally, and then all at once. She turned her head slightly and looked at him. Stephen's expression was not one of concern, not the performance of concern that cameras invite and television has learned to expect. It was simpler than that. It was the expression of a person who has decided that being present is more important than being useful. He met her eyes and gave the smallest possible nod. Not "Are you okay?" because that was obvious. She was not okay. And asking the obvious question would have been a way of making the moment about the question, rather than the moment. Just a nod. "I'm here. Take whatever you need." Claire looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the keys. Then she said very quietly into the microphone, I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Stephen took one step forward. "Don't be," he said. The microphone caught it. The whole theater heard it. 2 words, and the silence changed, became less like an absence and more like a held breath. "It's about your mom, isn't it?" Stephen said. Not a question, not a probe, just the gentle naming of a thing that had been in the room all along. Claire's hands pressed slightly harder on the keys without playing them. A long breath. "She loved this song," she said. "She she didn't get to hear the finished version, and I keep thinking I've dealt with that, and then." She stopped, her jaw tightened. "I'm sorry, this is your show. This isn't—" "Hey." Stephen's voice was quiet and firm in equal measure. "This is exactly what this show is for. What happened next is the part that nobody who was in the theater that night has ever been able to describe with complete accuracy. Not because their memories are faulty, but because some moments resist the precision of language. They can only be approximated, circled, gestured toward." Stephen Colbert sat down on the piano bench beside Claire Ashworth. He did not play the piano. He is not, by his own cheerful admission, a pianist. He knows a handful of chords from a college guitar phase and the general principle of how keyboards work, and very little beyond that. He put his hands on the keys. He looked at the sheet music on the stand, the song's handwritten lead sheet, which Claire always brought to television performances for reasons she'd never examined closely until this moment. "Where were you?" he asked her. She pointed to the line, the second verse, 4 bars from the end. "Remember the way the light came through," and then the word that had been the last word, remember, standing alone in the silence. Stephen looked at the line. His lips moved slightly as he read the melody through once without sound. Then he sang it. He sang it wrong. The melody landed in the wrong octave, low and rough in his speaking voice range, nothing like the pure instrument Claire had been playing with for the last 2 minutes. The rhythm was slightly off in the 3rd bar. He hit the final note of the phrase a half-step flat and seemed to know it immediately, his expression flickering with the particular self-awareness of someone who has just been publicly imprecise. It didn't matter. It didn't matter at all, because what came through, what the wrong notes and the missed rhythm and the flat ending could not obscure, was the intention, the pure, unornamented intention of a person who had decided that a song needed finishing and that he was the only one available to finish it, and that being bad at something was not, on this particular night, a good enough reason not to try. Claire began to cry. Not the public, composed kind of crying that performers learn to manage on stage, the real kind. The kind that arrives with no warning from somewhere very deep and brings everything up with it. And she began to play. Her hands found the keys again. Her hands that knew this song in the way musicians know songs they've written, in the muscle and the bone below conscious thought. She played, and Stephen kept singing badly and completely, and her voice came back slowly, like something warming up after being too cold for too long. By the final chorus, they were both singing. Stephen's voice was objectively and inarguably the weaker instrument in the room. This was not a duet of equals. It was something more interesting than that. It was a person with a great gift being accompanied by a person with a great willingness, and the willingness turned out to be exactly what the gift needed to find its way home. The last note of the song ended. The theater was silent for 1 full second. Then the audience rose, not with the polished, cued enthusiasm of a television audience that has been warmed up and prompted and positioned for maximum broadcast energy. They rose with the involuntary, unanimous movement of people who have witnessed something they cannot sit down in response to. Some were crying, some were laughing, some were doing both, which is what happens when an emotion is too large to fit inside a single expression. Claire sat at the piano with her hands in her lap and her eyes closed. Stephen sat beside her, still on the bench, his hands no longer on the keys. He was looking at the audience with the expression of someone who has just arrived somewhere unexpected and is taking a moment to understand where they are. Then he looked at Claire. "She heard it," he said quietly. Claire opened her eyes. She didn't say anything. She nodded once slowly, the nod of someone accepting something that cannot be proven and doesn't need to be. Stephen nodded back. He stood up from the bench. He offered her his hand, not to shake, but to hold briefly, The way one person holds another person's hand when the only thing left to do is acknowledge that you were both here, in the same room at the same time when something real happened. Claire took his hand. The audience was still standing. The segment ran 11 minutes past its scheduled length. Nobody cut to commercial. Patricia Ewan in the control room kept all 3 cameras rolling until the last audience member sat back down, which took a while. When her assistant asked afterward why she hadn't cut away during the silence, the long, unmarked silence after Claire stopped, she thought about it for a moment and said, because it wasn't dead air. It was alive. You could feel it. She was right. You could feel it. Everyone in the theater felt it, and everyone watching at home felt it, though they would have described it differently, each in the private language of their own losses and their own unfinished songs. Claire Ashworth did not speak to the press in the immediate aftermath. She didn't post about it. She went back to her hotel and called her sister, and they talked for 2 hours about their mother, the kind of conversation that grief delays and delays and delays until something finally makes it impossible to delay any further. In the morning, she sent one message to the Late Show production office. It said, "Please tell him thank you. He'll know what for." Stephen, when he received it, read it twice. Then he wrote back 3 words. She heard it. 6 months later, Claire released the song as a single. The official recording, studio, polished, produced, was included on the album. But on her website, available for free, she uploaded something else, the raw audio from the Late Show performance. Not cleaned up, not mixed, not mastered. The stop verse and the silence, and Stephen's wrong notes, and her voice coming back, and the final chorus with both of them and the audience rising. It has been listened to, as of this writing, more times than the studio version. People write about it in the comments, which are unusually for the internet, almost entirely composed of people talking about their own unfinished songs, the things they couldn't complete, the people who didn't get to hear the finished version, the moments when someone showed up and sang badly beside them, and it was somehow exactly enough. Stephen Colbert has never spoken about that night in formal interviews. When a journalist once asked him about it obliquely, referencing a performance that moved everyone in the room, he smiled and said, "I've been lucky enough to be in the room for a lot of things." He left it there, because some things don't need commentary. Some things are complete exactly as they are. The silence and the wrong notes and the voice finding its way home. Some nights the music stops, and the right response isn't to fix it, it's to sit down beside it and sing.